From the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, we knew that Black and Brown communities would face devastating health, social, and economic impacts. Communities that have been systematically and historically exploited and marginalized by racist systems and policies. The suffering has been deeply disproportionate.
Maintain social distance, please, and 2 lines.
58 years on this planet, I've never experienced anything like this. It's a sad time.
But our communities have also been resilient and used this current challenge as an opportunity to catalyze change. That's why we are gathering Brooklynites virtually to hear their experiences, their solutions, and how we can create a better future together. This is Brooklyn Insights 2020. It's time for change, and change starts here.
Afternoon. Thank you for joining us today for the first discussion in our Change Starts Here webinar series. This series builds on the work of organizations and communities supported through Brooklyn Community Foundation's Brooklyn COVID-19 Response Fund. I'd like to share a few logistical notes. Throughout our session today, please submit any questions that you have in the Q&A box. You can find the Q&A box on the bottom of the screen. We will address your questions towards the end of the webinar. We also have live closed captions available. Please look to the bottom of your screen to turn those on by clicking the arrow on closed caption and selecting Show Subtitle. Throughout the webinar, you can look back at what has been said by clicking on View Full Transcript, or adjust the size of the captions on your screen by clicking on Subtitle Settings. Before diving in, a few words about Brooklyn Community Foundation. Founded in 2009, we are the first and only public foundation dedicated to New York City's largest borough. Everything we do is rooted in our explicit commitment to racial justice. To date, we have granted more than $60 million to vital organizations working across our borough. We launched the Brooklyn COVID-19 Response Fund in early March 2020, and it was among the first funds nationally to prioritize addressing the pandemic's impacts on Black, Indigenous, and other communities of color. In the first phase of this work, we distributed $3.3 million through 420 grants to 246 organizations across our borough, thanks to the generosity of more than 1,600 donors. Our next phase of grant making will bring the fund's total commitment to nearly $7 million. We continue to fundraise for our Brooklyn COVID-19 Response Fund because we know that there is still a long road ahead. The systemic inequities exacerbated by the pandemic will not disappear when this pandemic subsides. We began phase 2 last fall with Brooklyn Insights 2020, an 8-week community engagement process to learn from and partner with the communities most impacted by the pandemic in order to identify and invest in community-led solutions to achieve structural change, as well as address ongoing urgent needs. We released our report on Brooklyn Insights 2020 last week, which you can view at bcfny.org/COVID-19/phase 2. Today, we are thrilled to premiere a new video in our Stories of Brooklyn Insights 2020 series, right here for you.
There are many people who can't even put food on the table. There are many people being, kicked out of the house. The system is not there to support us in somehow. When I was a baby, my dream was always to come to the U.S. I was born and raised in Honduras at the age of 13, so I would describe myself as a citizen of the world. It's kind of hard to be in Honduras because it's very homophobic and machismo. I heard that in the U.S. gay people can get married. Somewhere in the world, people are being accepted and being themselves. So for me, I was just looking for that space and find my own happiness and be myself. So I was just I'm ready. And the youth organizer at Churches United for Fair Housing. I think it came to be with fighting for my own case, immigration case. We crossed the Rio Grande and we ran. We were like 100 people. I was the youngest. I was 13 years old and I was one of the first to kick up. They sent me to like an accompanying minor house. ¿Y usted ha recibido algunos beneficios como unemployment insurance, el desempleo?
Yo no he recibido nada de eso porque como yo trabajaba pero no me pagaban con cheque.
Many of them, they don't qualify or they're undocumented.
My neighbors are still struggling to pay rent, to do the basic human needs. I like that feeling to be doing community work and just organizing. And I think that I want to reach out to many youth.
Like being undocumented, trying to find a job that is like with the skill levels that we have, it's hella difficult because the jobs are usually like for undocumented people. Our jobs are like a lot of labor.
And work is not only meat delivery, as you were saying, or restaurants,
Yeah,
or cleaning
labor.
houses. And so it's just like more professional opportunities, more internships. You know, the summer process that we did, I just get really hyped in being around community. Every day rallies and like protests.
Tell me what community looks like. This is what community looks like.
There is so many young people and people just join in, you know, and the group will get loud and loud and loud to we make noises. I would like to see citywide or nationwide, like undocumented people getting a pass to citizenship. They're the ones who are keeping the economy, keeping everything up. Who are the ones cleaning the houses right now? Who are the ones cleaning the schools, the hospitals? Our black and brown immigrant people, and marginalized people. And they're not getting the first help.
Una moratoria que no lo pueden desalojar a nadie después de mayo 1.
We are all living in this pandemic. And we are still kind of choosing who gets service or not. Let's keep marching. Let's keep fighting. Let's not stop.
This is Brooklyn Insights 2020. It's time for change, and change starts here.
A big thank you to Brian, one of Brooklyn's change makers working to create a more equitable and inclusive borough. Brian is an example of one of the powerful voices we heard in the listening sessions. I'd like to welcome our first speaker to join us. I'd like to welcome Renee K. Smith, our Brooklyn Insights 2020 Community Engagement Consultant. Renee K. Smith is a strategist who believes that everyone can manifest their dreams by creating a strategy that encompasses the right people at the right time. She has had the privilege to lead community engagement projects with organizations like the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene and Ifatayo Cultural Arts Academy, as well as assist in building coalitions among local arts and cultural nonprofits led by people of color. Her tenure as a nonprofit leader, thought partner, and manager has led her to develop systems to increase transparency, accessibility, and efficiency using technology and the passion of an organization's human resources. As a youth development worker, Renee's impact on the community has afforded her the gift of assisting and watching multiple generations within families in Brooklyn thrive. As an artist and entrepreneur, she has traveled, performed, and presented around the world, including places like Prague, Italy, London, France, Cuba, Brazil, Guinea, Senegal, Ghana, Benin, and Jamaica. As a wellness practitioner in flower essence therapy and Reiki, she is founder of Akika Flower Essences and Apothecary, a wellness practice that uses the power of plant intelligence through flower essences and herbal infused products cultivated to assist with the healing and transformation of one's soul journey. Renee is a Brooklyn native, a mother, an artist, a healer, an alchemist, herbalist, strategist, cultural arts curator, flower essence practitioner, reproductive justice advocate, and a community member. I am delighted to welcome and turn the mic over to our first speaker, Renee.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me here today. And also just, I want to also thank Brian. I had not seen that clip, and it's actually beautiful, beautiful way of representing what occurred and what is continuing to occur in Brooklyn. So I wanted to share a couple of highlights from the process and the report. And I think it's really, really important that, one, I want to thank community for allowing us to have these conversations with them, for allowing us into their thought process, for allowing the opportunity for truth and justice to really be kind of the guider for the process. So we were able to host 15 community engagement sessions, and our 16th session was a way of kind of bringing everybody together again to share what some of the insights were. Community organizations that were in the 10 priority neighborhoods that Brooklyn Community Foundation had already identified, which included Crown Heights, Bed-Stuy, Sunset Park, just to name a few. Places where we were seeing lots of not just immigrant communities, second and third generation immigrants staying here, but also those who were also still moving through the pandemic. So one of the things that we wanted to highlight in the report was this idea of first responders, right? That many of the organizations, even though not deemed as first responders, were first responders in their communities. They were the first places that community members went to find some kind of aid and some kind of relief. It's important to note that many of these organizations, though their mission statements and the way in which they work was a very specific way of working, that they pivoted at the drop of a dime to really ensure that community members were getting the things that they needed. For example, we talked with Mixteca, and they talked about the fact that, they hadn't been doing a food pantry, but they started doing a food pantry because it was what the community needed. And when they first started, they were doing cooked food because they thought that's what they needed. And after kind of listening to community members, they heard that they actually really just wanted like the grains and the rice and the beans so that they would be able to, as community members, to understand how to stretch the resources. So those were the places where we were seeing this idea of first responders really come out. We also had an opportunity in our process to really allow the community members, the community organizations that we partnered with, to define what the conversation would be about, right? Because in this opportunity to create what I like to call radical listening, right? This opportunity to listen without the need to respond, but really just to be in conversation of what it means to be community. We were able to really hear what has been going on in the community. And so organizations like the Alex House Project and Vive Theater, Groundswell, and Miss Teka, as I mentioned earlier, the 67th Precinct Clergy Council, Extreme Kids. So all of these are organizations that not only are within the priority neighborhoods, but also serve very specific people, including, peoples with disabilities and caregivers. So like Brooklyn Community Services, BCS, they specifically wanted to look at caregivers during this time because they were, the ones that weren't getting a chance to take off, and they were moving from a place where they had a schedule that was, had some space in it to 24-hour service. So these were the things that we talked about. These were some of the themes that came up. We were also able to guide the conversation with 3 very specific questions, right? So one of the questions, was around what inequity or inequality existed prior to the pandemic that made access and wellness unattainable, right? And then the second question was, how did the pandemic affect access to services? And what have you observed in your community? Because what we realized was that the community itself were not only the first responders, they were also documenting what was happening, right? We could hear it from what we thought media was telling us, but media wasn't telling us what was happening on a hyper local level. People who decided to create food pantries, people who decided to cook for their neighbors, people who decided to help with raising the children, people who decided to create homeschool pods because they needed assistance with transitioning to complete remote learning. All of these things were happening on a very hyper local level. And so being able to hear that in the actual listening sessions was really, really powerful. And the third question was, what solutions can be created to remove barriers to access, and how can we ensure equity through this access? Organizations like the Griot Circle, which served LGBTQ elders, and really talking about the intersection between being LGBTQ, being Black, and then also being an elder, and what the isms and schisms that actually exist that made it difficult for them. Access to transportation, not really getting information when it came to finding solutions for vaccinations, or those being, being able to actually get counseling services because during the pandemic they had lost some of their loved ones. So that had been a lot of the conversation. Another part of the conversation that came up was when we had the session with Batanza's Health Center. And so what I loved about that one was that we were talking about what it means to have community health and what community health looks like. And that in that process, it's important for us to know that this idea of serving people where they are, meaning we were in a remote state. We are in, and still are in, most of the pandemic a year later. And that in order to really serve community, we had to meet community at where they were. So the doors of the community center could no longer only operate from 9 to 5, because people may be available at 7 and they may be available at 9. So how do we create an opportunity for people to really be able to access and use the community health center as an actual resource? And that even when they were doing remote and telehealth, that they were creating opportunities for community members who had issues with technology and the digital divide to come into the center and still meet with their doctors through a telehealth session where the doctor was still logging in remotely. So finding solutions that really were able to ensure that people were still being able to access the sessions. I think that the other piece that really came out of this process were some of the quotes that we talked about, some of the areas that were kind of highlighted in this process around well-being and mental health and trauma. And so, one of the things that I think came out for me that was really, really big was also this quote from Reverend Montrose, where he said, food should not be political, right? That, the opportunity to pool all of the resources of all of the food banks that were happening within the community that were led by faith-based organizations allowed for community members to be able to access food every day of the week. Right? It didn't mean that they all needed to now become a food bank 7 days a week, but they were thinking about how do we pool our resources together so community would have access every day. And so one of the things that he shared was like really politicizing food was difficult because a lot of the food banks, specifically in Brooklyn, had been shut down. And so again, this idea of local organizations pivoting to be able to provide that resource to communities started happening. People who weren't providing it before were doing it because of the major shutdowns that were happening with food banks. So I thought that was also a really, really important piece to talk about. And I think the final thing I'd like to share is that, the space itself that we created, even though they were virtual, was this opportunity to listen to each other, right? To understand that through this process, everyone was experiencing loss, and we were dealing with loss in a very specific way. Some of it had been to continue to push through, and some of it was to take a deep breath and to pause. And so we were in the process of talking through each of these topics. We're also acknowledging, what was happening and what was transitioning. So a great example of that was, when we talked with Extreme Kids, And we were talking about young people who were differently abled and their families and how they were dealing with remote schooling. And that as much as we think that the mute button is a great opportunity for everyone to be able to hear what's going on, for young people who spend a lot of time feeling as though they're not heard, to mute everyone at any given time really does take away some of that autonomy that we had been building all that time. So that was a really like powerful thing to think about and to talk about in the process. And I think the last thing I'd love to just kind of share was the dedication that we wrote at the beginning of the report, which of course, now that I said it, oh, there it is. I cannot find it. There it is. So the dedication for the report read as such: to those who have been lost and to those who continue to push forward when the world was asked to pause, we honor your contributions to our present moment. We will continue to honor your legacy by being keepers of your stories, triumphs, and victories. May this moment in time allow for the continued expansion of the greatest forms of human expression: compassion, patience, love, and resilience.
Thank you, Renee. That was really, I love that dedication because I feel like it really sets not just what was discussed, but the intention behind community engagement and behind engaging in these listening sessions and this real community engagement and accountability process that's always ongoing at Brooklyn Community Foundation. So thank you for that, Renee, and thank you for sharing some of the reflections from just like such expansive conversations. I'd like to now introduce our remaining panelists, Executive Director of Vive Theater Experience, Toya Lillard, and Brooklyn Elders Fund Advisory Council member Samuel Manning, who are both involved in Brooklyn Insights 2020 listening sessions. Toya Lillard is a theater director, artist, activist, and educator. A native Houstonian, Toya graduated from Houston's High School for the Performing and Visual Arts. She has directed plays, developed curricula, led advocacy efforts, and implemented innovative teaching artist training programs, both in and out of our city's schools. Prior to joining Vive, Toya served as Director of School Programs for the New York Philharmonic Education Department, where she helped to develop its nationally recognized school partnership program. In addition to leading Vive Theater Experience, Toya is also part-time faculty at the New School, where she teaches global dramatic literature, devised theater, and Portfolio 1. Toya is also an adjunct professor at CUNY City Tech, where she teaches Black theater. I would love to audit that course, by the way. Toya holds a BA from Vassar College and an MA from New York University's Gallatin School of Individualized Study. Toya serves on the board of the New York City Arts in Education Roundtable and is an affiliate representative on the board of the Downtown Brooklyn Arts Alliance. Welcome, Toya. Samuel Manning is a New York City-based grant writer and a member of our Brooklyn Elders Fund Advisory Council. Since 1979, Samuel has worked as a consultant, primarily working with small to mid-sized nonprofit organizations, writing grant proposals, prospect research, and developing fundraising plans. His projects range from writing proposals for a specific new program to prospect research and fundraising guidance to ongoing grant writing and development work. Samuel's grant writing work is represented in all 5 boroughs. He joined the Brooklyn Elders Fund Advisory Council in 2019, which partners with the foundation in shared decision-making and grant-making to support Brooklyn-serving organizations that are working to ensure that older adults have the opportunity and agency to achieve social and economic success. I'm delighted to welcome you both to the conversation as we dig a little bit deeper into Brooklyn Insights 2020 and our whole experience from all these different perspectives.
Good to be here. Good to be here.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. So Toya and Sam, I want to come to you first and ask, we find ourselves a year into the pandemic, and when we were thinking about, when we were developing Brooklyn Insights 2020, we knew that we would be reflecting on what has taken place over the past year, but also that there were layers, right, to the issues we would be talking about, because a lot of these challenges didn't start in 2020, right? These are historical, deep challenges that have existed in our communities. And we also know that a lot of the solutions that communities have been able and had to respond with, right, are also, some were new in 2020, but those grew out of a foundation of deep community work. So can you, in reflecting on all of that, can you, and Toya, I'm going to come to you first, but can you just talk about your experience participating in Brooklyn Insights 2020 and just kind of where all of that came up for you?
So firstly, participating in Brooklyn Insights 2020 was a great experience for our organization because we love any excuse to come together and talk. And it's a practice we're going to keep, these community conversations. We actually had another community conversation that was a grant proposal. So thank you, Philanthropy, for responding to our call to make these grant proposals more, doable. So we held a similar conversation that constituted our actual proposal, which was amazing.
I love that.
So then backwards mapping from the Brooklyn Insights 2020, we had in many different iterations done a similar sort of come together and figure things out. When Renee used that word pivot, I was triggered because that seemed to be what everybody had done like in a day in March.
Absolutely.
And I say this all the time, I turned, my computer and I'm seeing all these little kids pirouetting in, Zoom rooms. I'm like, are these kids happy? Did anyone ask these kids if they wanted to wear tutus and pirouette and pivot? So I thought about our population and our folks, and I better not, wait a minute, before we go pivoting, let's figure out if we're dancers first, right? So we needed to figure out, are we dancers? No, we're not actually. And so pivoting for us was not possible, considering the fact that, Black girls are now considered the most at-risk group in the country, according to the New York Times, you can look it up, and that they were, already writing and performing about some serious issues, so that for us to assume that they wanted to make theater in a Zoom environment in their homes, that many of them were fleeing to come to our program, would have been a mistake. Understanding and enough props to the organizations who could do it in 24 hours. Like, my hat goes off to you. For us, it required a lot of conversation first with our staff, then with every participant to figure out if that's what they wanted to do. Once we were clear that that's what they wanted to do, we went about figuring out how to do it. I did not. At that point, I didn't even know how Zoom worked, to be honest with you.
Many of us, right?
We would chill until we could come back outside and then make some theater then. But hats off to Vibe staff, some of whom are in the room, that figured it out, and figured it out in a way that came as the closest approximation to what we would do in person as I could have imagined, and even beyond my own imaginings. So these community conversations for us, by the time Brooklyn Insights 2020 came along, we had been having these conversations. And so it was really refreshing to have one of our community partners really partner with us in holding space for our young women to talk about what they needed.
Thank you, Toya. And, I think you touch on so many important things there. I just want to kind of zoom in on a couple. One is that a community listening practice is just that. It's a practice that may have processes in it, but it's something that you're constantly engaging in, right? And it takes time. It doesn't happen overnight just because an emergency happened, right? Like, you have to move at the speed of community, move at the speed of trust in community, right? Like, it's a very layered process. The other thing that you shared, and I can't, let the very challenging term pass without talking about it, but at risk, right? And when we talk about communities and individual people and groups of people being at risk, I think it's important to always say we are talking about at risk because they are targeted, at risk because they are underinvested in, at risk because they are oppressed and exploited, right? So it's an experience built out of a condition. And I hear that, you know, so much in what you shared. So thank you for that framing, Toya. I want to toss it over to Sam and, you know, tell us about your experience with Brooklyn Insights 2020 as a community member and as one of our advisors.
Okay, great. And thanks for having me here. It was a great experience. I think it was a tremendously unique cross section of people who brought a lot to the table. I was impressed with the level of cross section of African American, Latino, Hispanic, Caribbean. We covered all cross sections. So hats off to the Brooklyn Community Foundation and creating and building that Elders Fund, because you gave us a cross section to work with. And then on top of that, just meeting with them and dialoguing with them and getting to know them. It was a great group of people, just bringing their level of experience, work, life experience. It was unique. And then just looking at it from a perspective as being a senior and how we were going to impact our community and what was critically important to us. So the listening became the main point in the room. Everyone heard the same question, but yet we had filtered it through our own lenses and our own life experiences, which made it rich. And it made it rich in terms of sharing that experience too as well. So for me, it was very rewarding. As a writer, I took it all in and documented it. And I said, wow, that's interesting how people see it through the lenses. And then that add now, that was pre-COVID. And now we met again during COVID. So it was good to see everybody and just say, okay, I'm glad you're well. I'm glad you're doing good. And, you know, and now let's continue to impact our Indigenous community here in Brooklyn. So for me, it was very rewarding.
Thank you so much, Sam. And I love that you can speak from the perspective of being engaged in that practice with us as a foundation, right? Like the Elders Fund Advisory Council started in 2019. Mm-hmm. So you all have had opportunities to collaborate, not just in times of crisis, but really have that foundational relationship to come back together and have these discussions.
And in a short period of time too, as well.
Yeah, you're right. A lot changed, right? And also just like speaking to the beauty of the diversity of voices that were present. You know, we heard from Brian in the intro, and he's on the younger side of the spectrum, right? And then we have our elders coming together to share their experience, just across immigration experiences, across communities, geographically, across races and ethnicities. It's very, very powerful coming together. And so Renee, I want to pivot back to you. Pivot, the word is in my mind now. So it's like shift back to you. And talk a little bit more about, again, the pivot, right? The ways that, because there were so many amazing examples that came up in the conversations, the ways that our nonprofit partners changed, evolved, responded. Can you share some of the other examples that you saw from organizations?
Yeah, sure. I think one of the ones that came to mind was from the Campaign Against Hunger. So they, you know, have been doing kind of the food bank work for some time. But when they went from doing, like, I think the number was something like, you know, almost 1,000 meals a week to almost, you know, tripling that. And moving from actually having one space to having a warehouse, to then moving from a model of a food bank to a food hub, right? So this idea that, you know, the need was so great that they needed to respond, right? And then in their thought process of responding came these other questions around, well, how are we building capacity with our team? Understanding that as an organization, a lot of their physical kind of packing of the bags, packing of the boxes came from volunteers who are also dealing with COVID scares, not being sure if they could go into certain spaces. Like, how do you continue to motivate people to keep going? And so we talked a little bit about, you know, we had their listening session with their staff to really kind of talk through what have you all experienced and how are we framing some of this information that's coming from your experiences into processes and policies that will support you all continuing to do this work, right? Because you all have already responded. You have the warehouse, you've been doing somehow you've been doing it, right? But how do we create this in a way that the capacity that's built becomes sustainable, right? Because the pandemic is not going to go away. People needing food is not going to go away. All of the things that have been brought to the surface because of this, they're not going to go away. They're not going to go away tomorrow. So part of this is really being able to understand that this is a marathon. It is not a sprint. How do we create opportunities for you all to be able to do this marathon in the best way possible without, the burnout, without the, people getting ill and getting sick? How do we continue this line where you all are thinking about it? So that was one of the places where we were talking very specifically to the staff members who were continuing to give services through this pandemic. I think another one that was really big was when we had the conversation with the Alex House. They were one of the first, Alex House Project. They were one of the first listening sessions that we hosted, and they do a lot of work with young parents and helping to train young parents. And so, part of what they were talking about is, how are they supporting young parents in hearing and knowing how to advocate for their children, right? Because part of an underlying, and I know we'll talk about this a little later, but an underlying issue that was raised is not just around racism, but it's that the policies that have been enacted, the agencies that are able to enact those policies are coming from an inheritance from slavery, right? This understanding that Black and Brown people are making choices for their families, and that those choices aren't trusted, not for anything other than, that slavery had us in a space of understanding that we were property. Right. And so those kinds of policies still exist. And so you have young parents who are fearful in the decisions that they make about their family because they understand the ecosystem that's happening inside of their home, but they are receiving ACS cases for their children not logging on to school. They're receiving ACS cases because they decided not to take their child to a doctor's office for a scratch that they got because they were running around the house because they can't go outside, right? Understanding that if I take them to the doctor's office and it's not a wellness doctor visit, it's possible that I'm exposing them to something. And having somebody else impose the power of, you have to go or else this is going to be the punitive way that we're going to take that decision-making process away from you, is what they're dealing with. And so the Alex House in that conversation was able to kind of hear what had been going on in community and figuring out other ways to help them advocate for, what's the process and what's the steps and where could they step in, right? And be able to allocate resources to that. So I think that that was really, really powerful because it's not so much just the, just trusting that you're making decisions for your family that will be great for your family, but that you're making and have the autonomy to make these decisions and those decisions be respected. And so that was a really big one for me. And I think those two are what stood out. I'm trying to think if there was another one. I think I gave the example about.
I'm going to invite Toya and Sam back into the conversation to talk about challenges as well, because Renee, I think you touched on a few really key examples, right? A challenge on the organizational level to scale up quickly, and then also think about sustainability, because the scale up it's not to meet a temporary need, it's to meet a long-term need, right? And so how do you build that into the infrastructure of an organization in a way that will allow you to continue to meet the needs in that way? But also, I think you gave a beautiful description and I think rich detail of what we mean when we talk about systemic inequities, right? We're talking about these systems that exist and influence people's individual lives, more often than not, the lives of Black and Brown families, and how that impacts the way that they're able to act as parents, be as individual people, right? Live as children. And so I want to also highlight that individual challenge that came up in the listening sessions. Toya and Sam, can you reflect on the sessions you participated in and speak to any particular challenges that resonated with you that came up?
Yep, I'll speak about a challenge as a leader. I don't know that this came up necessarily in our insights session, but I'm called to name that philanthropy was a challenge. And I know this may be unpopular, but that's what I do, y'all. I say
we like unpopular opinions. Toya, give it to us.
I'm here. So in March, April, May, June, you know, and many of, if you're in the room and you're a nonprofit leader, you know, you were flooded with these surveys, and you're thinking every day you're like opening this email from one of your funders thinking, is this the day where they're going to say, we just dropped some money, drop some money that we know there's a pandemic, we know there's systemic racism and sexism and everything, we're just gonna give you some money. No, there were these surveys that we were asked to fill out, and then come to find out that, you know, your favorite funders gotta fundraise too. They need some funds too. So the information from these surveys was being leveraged to support the OMG. So once folks kind of figured that out, there was some pushback, like, wait a minute, we're really suffering here. We could use, you know, a can of tuna or something. And we're spending all this time filling out these impact surveys. And I would go back and forth with my friends who would be like, you're wasting your time. Why are you doing this? I'm like, well, one day we'll get something, maybe. So real challenge, but then thankfully, through a lot of conversations and some deep listening on the part of some funders, things changed. As far as the Insight series, the challenges that our folks experienced during COVID-19 was an exacerbation of the challenges that they faced before. So as you know, I mentioned this New York Times article that came out in October of 2020. The title of it was "The Battle for the Souls of Black Girls." As if Black girls don't have, you know, like, wait a minute, who doesn't have a soul?
Right.
Whose soul is here? So the title in itself was problematic, and then naming Black girls as the most quote unquote, and I use air quotes intentionally because we avoid this language, at risk group in the country. Turns out that the pandemic and virtual classrooms did nothing to assuage the over policing and the intense disciplinary measures that were really focused on Black girls, particularly in New York City, where Black girls are 11 times more likely, this is double the national average, to be suspended from school for the same, you know, sort of infractions as their white counterparts. We don't talk about this. There's very little space held for girls to even name what happens to them in school. So we know that in our organization, our time is, you know, their time creating is really predominated by these injustices, by the ways that they are disrespected and disregarded. So the Insights meeting was really important to them, to have the ear of a real live funder and people in the room that are going to listen finally to things that they've been talking about for years. Yeah. So the New York Times article, while it may have been, you know, enlightening for the average New York Times reader, our girls read that and they were pretty mad, and mad at the way that they were described, mad at the fact that they were still nationally facing the same issues, and even more disturbed that there weren't resources. It seems like people wanted them to talk and share, but there wasn't a lot of reciprocity. I'll stop there because I know there's a lot.
No, but I think this idea of, you know, the individual experience versus institutional responses, whether they're media companies, philanthropic institutions, municipal agencies, right? Like there's this interplay where, in what you're describing, and I think what was heard in a couple of other spaces, is this this dehumanizing, right, littling of the individual human experience, and listening, right, being a way to listening and then pairing that with action, listening and pairing that with a response directed by what you heard, as a way to respect and really highlight the humanity of the individual person. Sam, before we pivot to next steps, I just want to ask you to come into the conversation and talk about other challenges that you heard.
And just real quick, the one challenge that I heard as a committee of elders met, here we were pre-pandemic discussing the quality of life for seniors in Brooklyn and around. How do we raise it? Where's the problem with transportation, social justice? Where's the problem with food equities? We were at that level trying to raise the quality of life, and then all of a sudden the table was turned upside down, and now we're in the midst of a COVID crisis, which just threw everything out the window. So now we're working back from a negative or a deficit just to get back at a level that really was subpar for seniors in the community till as well. So that was one of the main takeaways that I got, that was discussed with me at the table. And it was really much a consensus of why we felt it was so important for us to bond together, work together, and match the services that our funders were trying to achieve.
Thank you, Sam.
Marcella?
Yes,
Sorry,
Renee.
can I just share one thing? I think
Yes.
also, Mr. Sam, one of the things that was really, really important about your session was that it highlighted that in hyperlocal communities, many times people didn't understand what was happening outside of their community.
Right.
So having a group of people who were talking about what they saw, and one of the elders, she just said, I didn't know.
Right.
My neighborhood is one, and she was talking about, she was in Kensington. My neighborhood is one where everybody comes together, and we've been doing all of this work, and we seem to have so much, and I want to figure out how to give it to someone, right? And we were talking about the fact that these or other communities were already working from a deficit. So even to bring them up to a place where they were feeling like they were at level and being able to deal with basic supports was an issue. And so how was that happening? How were we living in one, borough and having a tale of two cities? That became a really, really big highlight. And I think that is also part of what needs to be a responsibility of those who are trying to be change agents, that what you see in one neighborhood, unless you act, is not what actually is happening in other neighborhoods. And so if you only use the ones that have really good numbers to continue to boost and say that you're doing the work, it also means that there are people who are invisible that will never become visible.
Renee, well said. Well said. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. So I want to talk a little bit about what's coming next based on everything that we learned, both from individual experiences, challenges, and new innovative approaches coming from community organizations, and how we are working in partnership to make some investments, right? And provide some support and help the work continue to go forward. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, and also save just a few minutes at the end for any questions that our audience members might have for you all. So we've already begun moving forward in our grant making and organizational support, taking lessons and recommendations from Brooklyn Insights 2020 to be very intentional about specific grant opportunities and clarifying areas of focus, and how we're going to use our resources as a foundation to respond to what's happening in Brooklyn. So the first thing we did was, again, I already mentioned, in beginning in March of 2020, we distributed immediate response grants through the COVID-19 response fund. And those were 1-year grants for a number of different projects that were community identified to address emerging needs in all areas of the borough, with a hyper focus on 10 neighborhoods, which you all can, all of our viewers can view in the report. But because we see that the needs are continuing to grow in some areas, we decided to commit another $300,000 for renewals of grants doing work in areas of food insecurity, support for folks that have lost wages. Another area that we focused on, which was really the first area of funding last year, was combating anti-Asian bias and discrimination and violence. We saw that before March, really. We started to see that in late January and February in New York. And so those were some of the first grants that we provided from the fund. We've made renewal commitments so that work can continue over the next year, because we see that the violence and the discrimination has continued to exacerbate in really devastating ways. So that's one area of investment. Another area has been related to community health outreach and support. There are still, we've all been talking about COVID for the past year, but there's still some confusion, misinformation, a lack of support in certain neighborhoods to receive information and be able to engage in conversations in ways that are culturally relevant and responsive and medically accurate. And so we actually just closed the funding opportunity, accepting applications last week for $250,000 in grants that will go back into those 10 neighborhoods that we've identified, to 25 organizations doing work around everything from COVID testing to vaccine access and navigating the very, very complex and confusing for some process of getting a vaccination appointment, and all the sorts of navigation support that may be needed to accompany that. Our largest investment, which we're really excited about because it's breaking new ground for us as a foundation, are our multi-year investment in social change, community-led social change grants. So these are 5 years of funding of up to $75,000. Yeah, Toya, yeah, I saw your eyes, right? But I think it's important, and I'm so glad that I got your reaction. The big change for us is that this is 5 years of investment. We already kind of as a standard have 3-year, multi-year grants, general operating support, which is incredible and really allows organizations to sustain their work, grow, and have the flexibility they need to meet the needs of their teams and their communities. With this social change work, we knew that we had to make a longer, deeper commitment because social change takes time, right? And this isn't about saying, okay, this is day one, the clock is ticking, what are you going to produce in 5 years? But understanding also, in addition to what we saw in 2020 in terms of the pandemic, we saw amazing uprises and social rebellion and, people power in the streets and in the houses of power in a way that we understand relies on ongoing investment in community organizing, in power building for people affected by oppression and advocacy and policy, people who are constantly doing that work, looking for the opportunity for those shifts, for those like great spurts of advancement. And I think we saw some of that in 2020. So we're making an investment in that area. And those applications just opened last week. So we are really excited to see what community-led social change work we can invest in and really partner with organizations on. And the other thing that you all brought up that is a constant in our work at Brooklyn Community Foundation, but we're continually deepening our investment there, is the capacity building work that we do with nonprofit organizations, nonprofit leaders, development leaders, and community-based organizations, because we, yes, want to invest in the work, but we also want to invest in the people doing the work and the organizations leading the work. There's a whole nonprofit social change infrastructure that requires investment, particularly that which is community-led and community-led by Black, Indigenous, and other communities of color. We really see ourselves as a partner in reinforcing the strength there. So I would just want to check in to see if we have any questions, and it looks like we have a question about grants. Let's see, what grants are available for newer organizations who may not have the budget or capacity of more established organizations? So it depends on what the budget size is, the area of focus of the work. I'll give an example of our investment in grassroots organizations. We, for the immediate response grants that we released last March, the minimum annual operating budget was $100,000. And for anybody who runs an organization or has looked at a budget, that is a super small operating budget. So those are like very small community projects. That was the entry point, and we intentionally dropped it to that level because we knew that a lot of the community response we were seeing, they were coming from mutual aid efforts. They were coming from, organizations that focused on a 5-block radius, and we wanted to be able to provide support there. The entry point for the multi-year, 5-year social change grants is still very low. It's $250,000, which again we're talking pretty hyper-focused small organizations. So there are entry points there. We also have an incubator program that works with organizations that are still forming, and we make investments in their development there. So I encourage the person who asked that question, I think it was an anonymous one, to check out our website. There's a lot of information there. You can email grants at bcfny.org with any other questions. One more question I see. What is something that you've appreciated most about working with your participants during these hard times? Toya, I'm going to send that one to you.
Yoga, of course. Come on now. So one of the things we've, changed as an organization is now, we're also a yoga studio. We provide free yoga to the people. So that's one great thing. And the other one is having our staff meetings visited by our therapist. Another thing that we have an on site all the time therapist. And so the last couple of staff meetings, she visits a staff meeting once a month, and it's so new, but it's so great. And it's one of the most, it's scary, but it's also enjoyable.
Oh, that's amazing, Toya. And that actually amplifies something we heard in the listening sessions. And that was a focus on the need for wellness support within organizations, also in communities, right? But looking at the experiences of staff in community-led organizations, many people living in the communities that they serve through their work. And so we'll also be doing some work in our capacity building offerings to make sure that wellness services are available to our community partners in that way. We are down, if you can believe it, to our last couple of minutes together. This has been such a wonderful conversation. I wish we could do it in person over coffee. We'll have to come back together at some point to do that later in the year. But I'd like to hear from you all as you think about, what's to come, the challenges that we've seen, the solutions coming up, or the solutions that we've seen led by community. Can you leave us with a closing thought and, just a brief thought that's still kind of sitting with you or that's pushing you forward? And I'll go to Renee first, and then Sam, and then Toya. What note would you like to leave us on?
That we are all having a human experience, and that through that opportunity, we're able to connect on a level that allows us to really push ourselves forward and really to thrive. And so I think constantly reminding, and it's hard that in 2021 we still have to do it, but constantly reminding that we are all having human experiences in this helps people to understand, to no longer just put it on being property, to put it on we know and can, speak for others, but that we have to open up and radically listen to each other when we talk about what we're experiencing and honoring that, so that the solutions that we create are ones that create sustainability. And I think that's the biggest thing here, that we've all lost, that we are all still trying to figure out what we're doing, but how do we create an opportunity to listen and create human experiences?
Thank you. Sam, what do you have for us?
Real quick, I think we need to continue to work in the spirit of collaboration. Brooklyn is a very unique, large environment. There's East New York, there's Brownsville, everything. So we need to continue to work in that collaborative spirit. For the funders, I continue to say the threshold, the dynamic, the paradigm has changed. It's time to look at the communities and the nonprofits in a different light, in a different dynamic, at a different threshold. We need to look at those that are making less than 100,000, even those that are making less than 50,000, but yet doing quality work in our community in terms of serving the people, seniors, youth, and other underserved communities. So I think that's the last things I want to leave as a parting note for the community.
Thank you, Sam. And Toya, before I give my closing remarks, I want to hear your closing thought.
Relationships are everything. We learn this in development, but it really is true now. And we all should be examining our relationships to our organization, our relationships to our supporters, and ask ourselves the hard question: are we really building relationships, or are we in a transactional situation?
You like to come through with those hard, unpopular opinions, but we love you for it. So as you all have heard, the work is far from over. For Black, Indigenous, and other people of color and communities of color, barriers to quality healthcare, education, housing, and financial security will not disappear when the pandemic subsides. Real change does not happen overnight. We know that. We've been talking about that. And that's why we are doing this big investment in long-term social change. And we're continuing to fundraise to make that possible. Change starts here, and it starts with you. Please consider making a donation today to invest in a better future for Brooklyn at bcfny.org/donate. Thank you for joining us today for this conversation, and be sure to sign up for upcoming webinars in the series at bcfny.org/webinars. Upcoming webinars include discussions with journalists, Mr. Kim on combating anti-Asian hate on Wednesday, April 21st at 12:30, and a talk with Heather McGee on her new book, The Sum of Us, What Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together, on Tuesday, May 11th at 12:30 p.m. Thank you all and have a wonderful day.